Right, so I wanted to make this video debunking the idea, the whole female oppression in modern times and kind of a little in the past idea that a lot of people have. Now, a lot of people buy into parts of it, but not all of it. A lot of people don't buy in at all, and a lot of people buy into everything. So, my position, I guess, just starting out, is that women are actually very privileged compared to men nowadays, and I don't even think it's a close argument. I've made a video about this before. I mean, you just look at the male suicide rates, women in college, the fact that there's, I think, about 20 different government taxpayer-funded organizations that just help women in the U.S. and none that help just men. And those are just a few things. But in the past, I just want to get it out that I think that it was definitely slightly beneficial to be a woman compared to a man, but no one really had it that good, in the 1800s and on, even the early to mid 1900s. Um, but just getting right into it, the gender pay gap is probably one of the biggest things talked about, but it's also the easiest to debunk, and I think the one that the least amount of people still believe in. But there's still a ton of people that still believe in it, namely Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. The fact that a prime minister of a relatively recognizable country on the world stage, obviously a first world country, still believes in stuff that's been thoroughly debunked. It's not even a question. And in fact, it's actually the other way around, in that believing in this kind of stuff, um, and putting in policy for this kind of stuff, which is things that people like Justin Trudeau have done, artificially inflates women, which artificially deflates men. So it's actually a completely reverse system where you're actually promoting sexism against men, but that's another story. But the gender pay gap is this idea that women earn about, I think it's 78 or 77 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man earns. And I mean, the easiest way to debunk that is just point out studies have been done that it's a, that study in and of itself. It was just a straight up how much money does the average man earn, how much money does the average woman earn. They don't adjust for hours worked, occupation, um, anything. Obviously, the reason why it comes out to be a gap is that women, they don't work as many hours as men. I know studies have shown that male doctors work more than, actually significantly more hours than the average female doctor. Um, and then you look at it within fields, men are more likely to become a higher level person in that field, and it's again not through sexism, it's through choice. For example, men are more likely to want to become a surgeon than a family doctor, compared to women more likely to want to be a family doctor. And that's more or less a genetic thing, it's not a sexism thing. The average man's going to have more ambition, more testosterone. Men tend to attract women more likely through their income. Women tend to attract men more likely through their looks. In fact, I think men are probably just as likely to not want to date a woman who earns a lot of money, because women have this natural thing in their body called hypergamy, which means they want to date someone who's have a higher, or at least very least equal, uh, basically sexual market value to them. So if you're the male doctor can date the female nurse and not really have any issues on average, but if you're a female doctor dating a male nurse, which not a whole lot exists, but um, there's a gap there, and it's the fact that the woman's going to be earning quite a bit more than the man, which means the woman's probably not going to want to stick around with a guy like that when she knows she could probably get a guy earning 3 or 4 times as much as a nurse. So that's why that gap exists. Obviously, women don't work as many hours as men. Women are less likely to be, again, really high up in companies and whatnot, and that's, again, it's not as much a sexism thing. It's more or less men just have more ambition, testosterone. It's not like there isn't women. There's always exceptions. There's definitely women that can do it, but men are just more likely. Other things is the fact that women were really oppressed in the past, and that's it's true to an extent, but it's also, what really bothers me is that anybody who makes that argument completely ignores the fact that, number one, women preferred their role, and number two, men's role was worse, and women agreed with that back in the day. Um, if you make the argument that, well, it's basically, women were cooped up in the house, they had to cook, clean, look after the kids, all that kind of stuff. Well, what they completely ignore is that men were working, 12-hour days doing manual labor, which I don't think anyone would look at it objectively and say that you'd rather, work in a coal mine or be farming, by hand for 12 hours rather than doing housework. Like, no one's going to make that. No one in the right mind will make that argument. The other thing, too, women didn't have the right to vote. That's the really big one. But again, a Supreme Court case during World War I ruled that men have the right to vote because they're subject to the draft, which means women don't have the right to vote because they're not subject to the draft. And I believe a poll, I don't remember which country it was from, but it showed about 75 or 80% of women didn't want the right to vote if it came with the being subject to the draft, which means saying that women were oppressed because they didn't have the right to vote it's insane, because that's like having two kids and asking one of them which toy would they rather want to play with, letting them pick, and then that kid complaining that the parents are favoring the other kid because they let him play with the other toy even though he wanted the other one. Like, it makes absolutely no sense to argue that, and most people aren't even aware of that fact. And even if they are unaware of the fact that women didn't want the right to vote if it came with the draft, and that's something that's not talked about a lot when you look at people. You talk about feminism. Obviously, it's much different nowadays than in the past, but people think of feminists as these people that were fighting for the right to vote, but that's not true. There was a lot of feminists that didn't want the right to vote if it came with the draft. But that's about all I wanted to do as far as this video. But just finishing up this thing with the gender pay gap. Another way of putting it in a more real world example would be, okay, so let's just assume that the gender pay gap does exist. Well, then a smart businessman would come along, and let's say he had some big company with tens of thousands of employees. He would come along, he would hire just women. He would say, well, yeah, we'll pay you 85 or 90 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man earns, which is more than what they would be getting paid in a different company, assuming the gender pay gap exists. Those women would make more money than they would make in the next company, and the guy would pocket the 10 cents or 15 cents difference, and he would make a ton of money, right? Because he's making an extra 10 or 15% than the next company, and he's paying his workers more, which means his workers are going to be more happy, they're going to be more likely to stick around, all that stuff. But no one does that, right? Because the gender pay gap doesn't exist. So that's a real easy way of putting it. And another way of other than just pointing out the studies that show that it's just a difference between choices between men and women. But that's about it as far as this video goes. Just wanted to make a video just debunking this idea that women were oppressed throughout history, and especially in modern times. Like I said, I think everyone had it bad going back, more than 50, 60 years ago and on. But the big problem I have is people nowadays, and actually it's even more nowadays, but in the past we completely ignore any negative things that happen to men, and we completely inflate the negative things that happen to women. And just the fact that people are doing that just kind of proves my point. But like I said, that's about it. I didn't want to talk too much in this video. I just wanted to do something relatively quick. So if you like to, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.